everyone. And thank you for joining today's Biodiversity for Sustainable Cities, a webinar series. My name is Vinit, and I'm a PhD student in the Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore. And today's webinar is very interesting. Not only do we have a panel of esteemed speakers who will be sharing, we also do have students from the Global Sustainability course joining us. The Global Sustainability course is an APRU course that brings together like-minded students with a passion for sustainability in an 11-week course. I think we are in our fifth week today. So for those students in the APRU Global Sustainability course, could I kindly invite you to rename yourselves with the GSC to be in the front of your name so that we can identify you later when we will have our group presentations. Second housekeeping measure is for today's webinar, we kindly request all participants to keep themselves muted throughout the webinar. And if you do have some questions that you would like to have clarified at the end of this webinar, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section instead of the chat. With that, I will hand over to Jerome, who will take us through today's webinar. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So first of all, I think we must thank Yekang and Christina for the organization for this webinar. If you can go to the next slide, that will be very grateful. Right, okay, so good morning and good evening. So why are we having this webinar? Is because we really think that biodiversity is of undoubted importance and essential to support all life on Earth, including humans. However, anthropogenic activities are now causing the crisis of biodiversity loss at unprecedented rates, especially for places like cities, which are the most populated settlements in the world and face great challenges in resisting biodiversity loss. So the question that comes to us is how to allow human development and biodiversity conservation to go hand in hand. Well, sustainable development is a key issue that needs to be resolved now and also in the future. In order to achieve such, what we are seeing is that no field alone, the current field alone will be able to resolve all these questions just by itself. But to tackle these questions for current and also for future, from all perspectives, you need interdisciplinary action and collaboration. So as a network for leading universities like linking Americas, Asia, and Australasia, the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, APRU or APRU, consists of 61 leading research universities in Asia Pacific, brings together thought leaders, researchers, and policymakers to exchange ideas and also to collaborate on practical solutions to the challenges in the 21st century. The APRU also leverages the members' collective education and research capabilities into the regional and global policy process and practice. So as you can see from the slide, there are different universities, and this is the main purpose for APRU also having many global partners. If you can click to the next slide. So there are a few key related programs for this One Pacific challenges, because after all, this is One Pacific. In a very short way of saying it, that will be groups including global health, multi-hazards, Pacific Ocean or biodiversity, digital economy, sustainable cities and landscapes, and also sustainable waste and management. If you're interested, please go to the APRU website and also this individual group website to which you'll be able to find more. What I would like to stress on is that this One Pacific challenges is also trying to address the different SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, as you can see, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. So if you can go to the next slide. So to address these global challenges, the two APRU programs, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, Sustainable Cities and Landscape, initiate this joint webinar series for researchers, educators, and practitioners to highlight issues that may affect sustainable cities and biodiversity conservation in urban areas. And today is the third webinar of this series. Before I hand over the time to Yekang, to make this really successful, I think there are many people that we need to thank too. Give me half a minute more, that we must thank Christina Benjamin from APRU, Fei Mo from Shanghai Jiao Tong University, Nathan No from the University of Sydney, and Amy Chan from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And last but not least, to make today's webinar really possible, we must thank Yekang Ko, who very kindly going to be serving as the moderator and is also the program director of the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscape. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our moderator, and I hope you enjoy the talk today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jerome, so much for your introduction and also all your efforts to make this webinar series happen. Thank you so much. So yeah, I'm really excited to introduce our three amazing speakers for today's webinar. So Jennifer Ray Pierce from Urban Biodiversity Hub and the University of British Columbia, and Sohyun Park, who is an associate professor at the University of Connecticut, and also the Gail Langellotto, who is a professor from the Oregon State University. So today's webinar, so each speaker will have around 20 minutes of talk, and then after those three lectures, we will have time for Q&A. So for those who have questions, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A sessions. So our first speaker is Jennifer Ray Pierce, who will talk about the urban biodiversity strategies, frameworks, and indicators review. So Jennifer is a political ecologist, urban planner, and urban biodiversity policy specialist with 18 years of experience with cities and nature. She's the co-founder of Urban Biodiversity Hub, which hosts the largest global database on biodiversity, urban biodiversity activities, and publishes research on local practices and global targets for biodiversity, and supports related indicator tracking and development for local governments. She has prepared local government tools and reports, including a biodiversity and ecosystem services mainstreaming toolkit for ICLEI, and the urban nature indexes for IUCN, and the science-based targets for cities for nature. Her published research includes global comparative work across hundreds of cities. She's now earning her PhD from the University of Columbia, British Columbia, on urban biodiversity worldviews and justice. Please welcome Jennifer. And let me stop sharing my screen so that Jennifer can share hers.
Thank you. I've unmuted myself on my phone, but I'm presenting on my computer, so I hope it's not too confusing for people attending to see me on my video while the sound is coming elsewhere. And I'll see if I can get this screen share to work. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Great.
Can you share the full, can you make it as a full screen view?
I think if I do that, I can't see all of you. Oh no, you're still there. Oh great. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
it worked. Excellent. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about urban biodiversity strategies, frameworks, and indicators. And this will be kind of a review across a lot of the work that has come out of the lab at Urban Biodiversity Hub, as well as a bit of my own work. But primarily it's a bit of a review with some of the most recent work that we've done at Urban Biodiversity Hub, where we specialize in researching these types of strategies, frameworks, and various measures for nature that are designed for an urban context and connecting those to global targets. So I'll start by talking about strategies for nature that are set up by cities and various frameworks that talk about the benefits of cities for considering nature, and even more time on understanding how cities impact nature and the role that cities play in conservation. Then I'll move on to the current status of frameworks that attempt to capture these ideas, and what's going on. And then I'll talk a bit about the indicators that are found within those and some of our research in making sense out of all of these indicators and their implications moving forward, particularly given that the Conference of the Parties, the 16th Conference of the Parties for the Global Biodiversity Framework is coming up in the next couple of weeks. So first of all, what are benefits to cities for nature? The three kind of primary categories that I think this falls under is the inclusive well-being of people within the cities. When we've looked at nature comprehensively, this is the potential benefit. Of course, there are studies that show that there are equity considerations and concerns that come up when nature benefits are applied unequally. But the potential, hopeful benefit is that we have well-being applied across all sectors of society. Increasing resilience to cities, including disaster risk reduction, increased food security, and self-sufficiency. And of course, ecological health. So having healthy, abundant, and diverse species and landscapes, which connects to the health of the inhabitants of the city. And I'm going to spend more time talking about the impacts of cities on nature, because this seems to be one that's less well understood. So what you're looking at here is a map of the world with a darkened section that indicates both urban areas and industrial areas based on ecosystem typology. So this will include not only like your typical cities, but also highways across the landscape. So, paved landscapes, places that have more of an urban character in terms of the ecological makeup of those locations. So the global ecosystem typology is a recent product out of IUCN that classifies the entire world according to many different ecosystem types. And they found that the urban ecosystem type covers about 6% of Earth's land area, which is much higher than previous percentages that just counted cities rather than all urbanized landscapes. When it came to just cities, it was more around 2 to 3%. So we know then that if we're able to make these built-up areas more nature-friendly, we can impact up to 6% of Earth's terrestrial area. We can also look at biodiversity hotspots and what's happening there with cities. And we can see that of cities over 300,000 in population, 383 of them are actively sprawling into biodiversity hotspots with a very direct impact of their increasing built-up area, decreasing the habitats of these important conservation areas. We can also look at land development potential. So if we look at what areas are urbanized now and what areas we anticipate to be urbanized by 2100. If we do some basic calculations, looking at the projected global population increase as well as various densities of potential development patterns, we can see the impact that cities can potentially have depending on the type of development pattern that they follow. So I'll first look at the suburban development pattern, which I'm classifying as approximately 1,000 people in a square kilometer, which is an example of this would be like the suburbs of Los Angeles. And if all the land development on average is suburban land development, the amount of land that will be taking up globally with this type of development is about the size of the circle you see there, which is approximately the land area of India. So that's quite a large area. By contrast, if we were to then do the same thing in an urban development place, meaning that the density that you see in the city of Paris of about 20,000 people per kilometer squared on average, the total development area is much smaller, which is represented by the blue dot. And then on the other hand, if we followed a more rural development pattern and people spread out beyond the cities with a less urbanized development pattern and being more rural, like you would see on average in the country of Panama, the amount of area that's taken up is larger than Africa. So we know that more urbanized development patterns take up less land, and on a global scale, it can make a big difference as to which type of development patterns we're encouraging cities to follow. We can also look at the indirect impact of cities. beyond where they're directly building, but where is their impact coming from in terms of consumption, and where are cities' waste products going and being metabolized back into natural systems? So if we look at the ecological footprints of cities, which are comparable to carbon footprints, but are more based on, instead of just looking at carbon, they incorporate carbon as well as impacts on biodiversity and other elements of nature. We can see that the indirect impact of the city is much larger than the city itself. So if you take this blue square and say that it is representative of the ecological impact of the city in terms of its footprint, in terms of area on the earth, the size of the city by comparison is about 1/200th the size of its total impact, which you can see here as the yellow square. And furthermore, we can break this down into the difference of impacts of things being consumed by the city versus waste products coming out of the city, including mitigation of carbon. And you can see that on the left is the resource extraction area, which is about 200 times the city area. And on the right is the area that's required to assimilate waste of the city, which is anywhere from 400 to 1,000 times as large. Let me just check the sound. Am I okay over here? Okay. Just getting some feedback. Okay. So then when we look at what are cities' potential impact on conservation, cities are where the people are. So any kind of conservation strategy that depends on people, which I think most do, will also be dependent on where the people are. And currently over half the population globally is in cities. We also know that cities are where the money is. So conservation that depends on investment and consumer demand will also depend on relationships with cities. And furthermore, cities are places of influence. They influence the media, the culture, the politics, and what's seen as a good quality of life or desirable quality of life is often set by the cultural standards that come out of cities. So these are the kind of building blocks that are necessary for conservation. So when we look at what is the impact area of a city and therefore what a city can use as a framework when developing their urban biodiversity strategy, I encourage them to use this urban bioshed diagram that indicates on the left in the green, more standard sector of conservation, which is about land, both conservation and restoration of land. But that's only one piece of the puzzle that cities can impact. So they also, on the bottom, you can see their impact through their consumption patterns, waste patterns, through pollution, production patterns that are done within the city and also move through the city as trade. On the right, we can see the societal influence that cities have. So this is the ability to connect people with nature and to center nature as part of good quality of life, as well as awareness measures for city. In the middle, we see equity and justice, because we know that if we are oppressing people, then that's not a way to go for conservation, because oppression of nature and oppression of people are, not two things that we want to trade off together. They come from the same place. And we can also see in the urban bioshed impact diagram the scale. So we can look at within boundary city concerns in the middle, going out to the hinterland, and then to global telecoupled impacts towards the exterior. So if a city is developing their strategy and they're covering each one of these segments of the urban bioshed diagram, then they can feel confident that they're taking a comprehensive approach to their strategy. So where do we see urban biodiversity planning happening? We see initiatives for cities and nature all around the world. They take many forms. In our database, we primarily measure biodiversity plans and strategies, often called local biodiversity action and strategy plans, which is LBSAP is the name. But they also can be embedded within comprehensive plans, within development plans, in climate action plans. There's all kinds of places where cities will incorporate concerns of their impacts on nature into their broader strategies. But we know that at least over 900 cities worldwide have initiatives for biodiversity in place, and I imagine the number is actually much larger. These are just the ones that we are aware of as of the time of this particular map. But we also know that these plans tend not to be very comprehensive across the entire bioshed or across different sectors of concern. They primarily are looking at that standard conservation approach of what is the land within the boundaries of the city. Are we conserving areas? Are we restoring areas? And spending less time on social and cultural impacts, educational opportunities, and economic connections, such as trade and consumption patterns. We also know that of the standards that are out there, there are many, and none of them have really reached a global standard for measuring what's happening in cities. Certainly not impacts, but also not including even how efforts are measured and how we go about kind of standardizing what cities are doing so that we can report at a larger scale. So this graph here is showing various frameworks that cities can choose when they're developing their biodiversity strategy. And we can see that the most popular one at this time was the Mayor's Monarch Pledge, which is a North American program in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, specific to monarch butterflies, which at this time had about 300 applicants in 2022. And that was by far the highest. So of the many thousands of cities that exist in the world, there's no one standard that has captured city actions towards nature. We also know from our research of biodiversity strategies that even when there are biodiversity strategies, they often are not measuring what they're doing. So they'll have action statements without any kind of follow-up measurement, either through an indicator or a target. So in this chart, we can see the darkest bar is indicating that the percentage of plans that covered these different thematic areas, and then the lighter gray bars are indicating whether that same statement was backed up by some kind of a measure, either an output or an indicator. Okay, so that gives us a general idea of what's happening in terms of biodiversity strategies. I want to now cover what's going on with frameworks and these guidance systems. Now, first of all, when it comes to what all is out there, there are many programs that we've identified that are frameworks that are used around the world to help cities with their kind of understanding their impact on nature and improving it. So here's a list of some of them. We've identified over 30 at this point. So there's many of these different programs, and there's more being developed all the time. So we don't have a lack of frameworks, that's for sure. But this huge set of potential frameworks does add burden to cities to figure out which one they should follow, what is the difference between them. So it's not exactly easy for cities, even though there are many systems out there. So we recently conducted a framework assessment looking at the list of about 30 frameworks in terms of what scale they're designed for, how relevant would they be to target setting, and how comprehensive are they in terms of themes across not only the urban bioshed, but also other thematic systems of various pressures against nature and this type of thing. And we were able to identify certain ones that had higher comprehensiveness and relevance. And I'm going to look in particular at one of these programs, which is listed, it's kind of tied for the top comprehensive number here, the Urban Nature Indexes program out of IUCN, as an example of a recently developed framework that I would like to showcase for you. So the Urban Nature Indexes, when we did this comprehensive assessment of frameworks, checked off some of the themes under thematic comprehensiveness, but not all of them. So on the left, you can see in green the themes that it covered, and the ones in orange were covered less. Okay, so the Urban Nature Indexes itself is designed to be flexible across various cities, comprehensively cover all the themes, to be science-based in its development, to recognize improvement by cities rather than having a single target, and to comprehensively bring together existing tools and standards whenever possible. It's backed by publication in Nature Partner Journal. and it covers 6 themes in its development. In each one of these themes, there are a handful of indicator topics, and cities are encouraged to, within each theme, to choose one or more of the topics within there that works for them. So in that way, it provides flexibility across contexts while still unifying city actions within the 6 themes. The guideline for the indicator topics describes the intent of the theme, the indicator, and instructs cities as to how to implement it, as well as accepting various alternatives and providing a scoring metric. There's also a website where cities can log in and insert their data, which provides them with various visuals as to how they're doing and whether they're progressing over time. So what we've seen from this particular use is that it helps with informing decision-making, tracking performance, and becoming more comparable at the global scale. And cities have told us that using the uni makes it easier to comply with their mandates, helps them to evaluate the impact of their actions, helps them use their resources more efficiently, and legitimizes their achievements. Okay, so now I've talked about one framework as an example and all the frameworks that are out there. I want to touch very briefly on indicators, which if we thought there were lots of frameworks, wait until you see how many indicators are out there for helping cities measure their impact on nature. So we recently reviewed a whole load of frameworks as well as existing plans to see where indicators were within various themes. So across the top, you see biodiversity plans, some national frameworks and local frameworks, and on the left, various themes. And the colored boxes indicate where there were indicators within those across those themes. So you can see there's quite a bit of variation globally. And I'm going to look just at this one row of sprawl and development. So if we take this one row and we unpack it, we found that there are 146 different indicators just within that one topic. We grouped them based on Global Biodiversity Framework targets, which gave us about 55 different groupings within each one of the targets, shown here as bullet points. And then we put those into information sheets and then spoke with experts, both in interviews and in a workshop, to try to rank them and figure out if certain indicators were more comprehensive than others, had better impact, were more relevant, more feasible for cities, and then developed a list out of that. So from that came a list of 17 potential indicators down from 146. So the intention here was just to show you how confusing it can be for a city to figure out how they're going to measure just one thing, and in this case, land use and sprawl and that impact on biodiversity. And how would you choose from among these indicators, even when experts are not able to narrow it down just to a couple? There's really quite a few different ways, and each measurement has its benefits, its pros and cons. So in summary, we can see that cities are absolutely key to conservation efforts. However, their plans are not comprehensive, they're not consistent, and they need standards. Then we also know that there's a whole lot of different frameworks and indicators out there for cities and nature. But cities need supports to navigate what's out there and to develop effective strategies that would link what they prioritize to the benefits that they would receive for planning for biodiversity. So we need place-based standards that are sufficiently flexible, but can also be brought together to report impacts at larger scales. So looking at a quick horizon scan of what's out there right now, we see an increasing interest in linking what's happening locally with global targets, such as the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Sustainable Development Goals. We see an interest in quantifying the impacts of what cities are doing and really the impacts of all levels of society and their actions, from corporations to subnational governments and society. And third, we see a lot of development and interest in making reporting mechanisms and guidance for target setting. So some example things that are popping up now and will be part of the conversation in the next couple of weeks at the COP include this whole nature positive framing and nature positive cities, natural capital accounting, or figuring out how to economically measure nature, nature science-based targets for cities, and various standards such as those developed by IUCN. So I hope that this has given kind of an overview of what's happening out there. And I'm very happy to answer any questions, and I'll put my contact information in the chat for those that would like to follow up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer, for your comprehensive review on the role of local governments in pursuing biodiversity and quantifying the impacts and the reporting. So the next speaker that I'd like to introduce is Professor Sohyun Park, who will be talking about the biodiversity positive design, empirical evidence, and case studies. So Sohyun Park is an associate professor in the Department of Plant Science and Landscape Architecture at the University of Connecticut. And before joining UConn, she worked in the Department of Landscape Architecture at Texas Tech University. She is also a certified sites accredited professional. And Dr. Park's scholarly pursuit revolve around the intricate interplay between natural and human systems, with a particular focus on sustainability and the health of ecosystems and communities. Her research aimed to advance understanding of how urban morphology, functions, and changes influence ecosystem services and their interactions with human well-being. A central aspect of her current research critically examines biodiversity positive design and seeking design solutions to address the ongoing biodiversity crisis at various scales. And today is especially Dr. Park's birthday. So happy birthday. So let me move. How do I stop sharing and give the floor to Professor Park?
All right. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for the birthday wishes. I appreciate it. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Sohyun Park. Today, I'm going to talk about my research that I was done with the support of American Society of Landscape Architecture, or ASLA. They funded some money for supporting a grant, supporting the research on biodiversity for the first time in their history. So I was very excited and also honored to be able to conduct the research. So here we have a snippet of the research summary. I'm not going to talk about the entire breadth of the research, but I'll try to make sure that it can cover some things that was pretty pivotal in the research. Biodiversity loss is an urgent and severe issue. As you all know, we have roughly 1 million species out of 8 million are under threat of extinction currently. And many species have been gone over the recent decades, and we have lost about 2/3 of insect species in the Americas in particular. And many other species are also endangered or threatened right now. And so the global community set a biodiversity goals to protect at least 30% of terrestrial and marine ecosystems by 2030, which is known as 30 by 2030 in the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Convention. And we just have 5 to 6 years left, a way to go to achieve this goal. The solution doesn't come in silo. It actually requires many sectors and agents to work together, whether you're in the design field or academia or a public sector. And so the work that we did is basically research review. So we actually looked at a bunch of peer-reviewed journal articles and secondary data and all available literature out there, which examine the biodiversity gains as part of their design project. And we just try to identify what's out there in terms of data and science-based evidences to find out some kind of patterns in those literature. And so we looked at the literature, like I said, and try to synthesize the empirical evidences from those literature, particularly on the landscape architecture or other design project, because there are a lot of very excellent articles about biodiversity, but it was really rare to find out those biodiversity performance of those designed landscape. So we really try to focus on those projects that are dealing with the green infrastructure, ecosystem restoration, or other project that you see over here as far as the themes. Okay. And just briefly, the screening process, we utilize keyword search so that you put the landscape architecture, nature-based solutions, or green infrastructure, or low-impact development. And like I said, we try to exclude any research that solely focus on frameworks or principles or policy-relevant articles, but more focus on those articles with the design or case studies as a focus. And so some of the research findings that we found out, there are a lot of projects that are focused on urban green spaces, including parks and green spaces, meadows and gardens, etc., and also green roofs and green stormwater infrastructure. And there are other types of projects that were addressed in those articles. And one pattern we found was that that a lot of researchers in the literature confirm the role of urban green spaces and parks in supporting diverse fauna communities, such as birds and butterflies and beetles. And the characteristics of those green spaces that matter included proportion of grass cover, tree density, and size, and park type, and etc. But the most common theme across the board was the connectivity and heterogeneity of landscapes, whether those are human-built structures or topography or nature component. So heterogeneity and diversity are very critical component of healthy ecosystems. So that goes beyond the diversity of animals and plant species to include the built forms, landscapes, and water bodies. You know, any construction project is basically have some opportunities to increase biodiversity. And then there are a lot of research, particularly increasing number of research that really highlight the roles of vacant lot that we have in cities as a potential biodiversity site. And also green roofs, there are considerable evidence of the ability of green roofs to support diverse species. And so there's one study talking about, you know, there were 91 ground beetle species found in one of those green roofs, and also a lot of birds, arthropods and gastropods were found on those green roofs. So, you know, how you actually make your roofs very diverse in terms of their plant composition will really matter. And all those elected green roofs were extensive green roofs, which are mostly self-sustaining with spontaneous vegetation and shallow substrate and low maintenance. And the characteristics that matter for the green roofs were native species and diverse plant species and soil depth and substrate composition and roof height. You know, there are a lot of more findings, but I would like to focus my talk on the case studies. So, you know, you can actually refer to my full research report that I included at the end of this slide. But you know, the one thing that we noticed is that there's a lot of research focused on the proposals for implementing designs based on the International Biodiversity Standard, or some planning or assessment work, or some kind of simulation scenarios with some experiment component in it. But you know, there are really few peer-reviewed studies of biodiversity impact of design project from pre to post completion. So that gives us a opportunity to do better on this area. So based upon the comprehensive review of those articles, well, actually we had about nearly 70 articles that we end up having some kind of a analysis, and out of those review, we identified 3 key strategy areas. So one was the planting design. So native plants are very important, in our environment, so that in every planting design, we can make those areas with more diversity, not only for structural, but also functional diversity that eventually complement each other. So the goal should be reaching 80 to 100% endemic heterogeneous planting that translate into a diversity of ecosystem services. So here's one example in the New York Botanical Gardens, and they planted a lot of native plants and meadow plants, nearly 100,000 plants over there. And there's some wetland aquatic plants that will actually clean the stormwater. And then beyond those wetland meadow, you can also have a magic meadow where species like butterfly weed attract pollinators and insect and birds. Second, you can consider the timing of the flowers when you do planting design, so that you can think about different flowers, timing and types of flowers produced, and pollinator mechanisms and other characteristics like traits or behaviors related to the flowering processes. So basically all these strategies were actually speaking to the designers, because they are very used to the traditional way of designing and landscaping. And so well, just, argue that by design, we can stagger flowering phases of using different individuals or populations of the same plant species at different times. And these strategies will also support fauna diversity. So an example about that strategy is the South Everglades Community Rooftop Garden. They intentionally curated native plant communities to address functional diversity and flowering timing and colors to attract pollinators. Another example can be found in the meadow at Old Chicago Post Office. Huge building. It actually crossed, I don't know, 7-8 blocks in the urban area of Chicago, and they actually transformed those flat, barren rooftop surfaces into meadow areas, and planting palette consists of a native and adapted perennials, and a lot of grasses help conserve the overall demand for water. And third strategy is about the integrated pest management, basically designing plant communities that facilitate integrated pest management, planting certain plant species that attract beneficial species and keep destructive species in check. And the Highline, very popular destination in New York City, is a great example of a successful IPM scheme. And then fourth strategy is related with utilizing allelopathic and companion plants. So when the objective is to minimize maintenance and the use of a synthetic herbicide, we should determine if we can use the plant that secrete allelopathic compounds such as Eugene, and consider planting dense native species that have a higher tolerance to these natural biochemical compounds, and basically, compete the weeds. And also there are some plants that can inherently beneficial to one another. And so these companion plants should be a consideration as well. And a good example, again, South Everglades Rooftop Garden, it has warrior greens that serve food source, but at the same time control invasive species. And also we need to leave some space for protected land areas, so that those land can be left undisturbed by humans and pets in projects. So we can create some space for species that thrive when there is no human disturbance. Prime example of that is the Dune Peninsula at Defiance Point Park in Tacoma, Washington, where signage was used to keep people on path and out of meadows and minimize disturbance to allow the meadow to establish itself. And then second set of strategy is related with transforming gray to green infrastructure. So when you have buildings or walls, you can think about retrofitting those areas with green roofs and green facade. And so vegetation can be allowed to naturally overtake the walls and roofs without compromising their structure, or we can actually use some technology to make that happen. Okay, and but planting design should be specific to place and slope. And so, for example, if you have a pitch roofs, that might benefit from moss planting, while if you have a flat roofs, that can accommodate plants with a deeper roots that can provide stormwater retention capabilities. And you can also consider the height of the buildings and architectural details, because that will actually matter for certain insect species and bird diversity and provide some nesting habitat. So some research indicate that high buildings are potentially less likely to be conducive to pollinator nesting, but high buildings with certain architectural details could possibly be more conducive for birds prone to cavity nesting. Again, the examples of a meadow at the old Chicago Post Office, they planted a lot of native meadow plant species on top of their buildings, and within its first year of establishment, this rooftop has become a very favorite spot for birds and insects. And lastly, whenever possible, we can include native grasses under the solar panels. This may deliver co-benefit in terms of energy efficiency and supporting vegetation and invertebrate communities. And an important factor to plan for it is the density of a photovoltaic arrays, which can affect a certain invertebrate, as well as high density plantings that can lead to the increased parasitism. And lastly, tracking performance is very, very important, so that I think it is very crucial to collect some pre and post project data and internalize systematic monitoring systems after the project is done, at least for 5 years, to obtain longitudinal data for researchers to work with. So this can be done through engaging citizen science and public-private partnerships and academic research collaborators. And also, like Jennifer introduced, there are tons of different metrics and assessment system out there, so that we can take advantage of using those things, so that maybe NBS self-assessment tool developed by IUCN or site monitoring framework can be very useful to monitor the performances. And collaboration is very key to building a strong community coalitions to protect and increase biodiversity. And community partnership can be built with trust with stakeholders. And we need to also include the indigenous communities in the conversations around the biodiversity to embrace their traditional knowledge and share the sense of biocultural heritage. And we have a great precedent here about that at AUT Living Laboratory in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where researchers partnered with indigenous Maori tribes to conduct a longitudinal experimental research for real-world biodiversity impacts. And of course, we need to expand collaboration between practitioners and researchers, and also increase the public awareness and campaigns around the biodiversity impact. Here are the examples of the India Mount Cultural Landscape Project in the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, engaged with the Dakota tribal nations to restore the native prairies landscapes. And while the prairie is a work in progress, much of the educational signage is in place with messaging in both Dakota and English. And so messaging is key to educate the public about the history and the site's sacred status. And all those details are actually in these reports, and you can actually scan the QR code over here in the slide and can access a lot more details. And lastly, takeaways. I'd like to highlight we need to design with multi-species in mind. And just as one person cannot be replaced by another, the same is true for individual species, whether plants, animals, or microorganisms, and have some planetary sense of place and design with biodiversity for all life forms. With that, I'd like to acknowledge the support from my two amazing graduate students and also a lot of authors that I had the privilege to review, and definitely our sponsor ASLA and other landscape architecture related organizations. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Park, for another comprehensive review about the landscape design perspectives. So like planting design and how we can transform from the gray to green infrastructure, and also again, how tracking performance is important. So our last speaker. Now we are moving on to the more horticultural science, like size-scale science. Professor Gail Langellotto, who will be speaking about the cultivating biodiversity in small spaces, plants, people, and practices. So Professor Gail Langellotto is a professor of horticulture at the Oregon State University, and where she also leads the OSU Garden Ecology Lab. So together with her students, she studies garden soils, microbes, insects, and plants to promote sustainable garden designs and management practices. Her interdisciplinary research spans the fields of entomology and horticulture, urban ecology, conservation biology, and social science, and also is conducted in close collaboration with gardeners, landscapers, designers, and nursery plant producers. Prior to joining OSU, she was an assistant professor at Fordham University in New York City, and also completed a postdoctoral research assistantship at the University of California, Davis. So please welcome Dr. Gail Langellotto.
Thank you, and thank you, Jennifer and Sohyun, for those amazing talks. I actually was going to spend a little bit of time trying to convince you that insects are important, because as someone who studies insects, oftentimes I find that the general public is not enthusiastic about insect conservation. So I was really thrilled to see insects referenced across both talks. Briefly, if you are not already pro-insect, I'm hoping you'll reconsider that stance, because they are incredibly important for multiple reasons. So first, when we consider that there's a direct link between biodiversity and ecosystem function, insects by some accounts are the majority of biodiversity on Earth. They also represent a large amount of animal biomass in the way that energy is transferred through ecosystems via the consumption of insects. I know that not everybody likes insects.
Would you like to share your slides?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was
If
sharing.
that was your intention. No worries.
Let me try this way. Are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Okay, great. For those folks who've had bad interactions with insects, relatively few of them are considered pests. And as a matter of fact, our society and civilization is strongly dependent upon the ecosystem services that they give to us, including pollination, pest control, waste decomposition, and food for other organisms. Thus, it was a big concern when we started seeing in 2017, 2018, 2019, reports about the insect apocalypse, which were news stories covering various research publications that had shown that there were drastic decreases in insect biomass, insect abundance, and/or insect species richness. Scientists are still trying to understand what is causing this precipitous decline in insects across the globe, But the number one thing that folks are pointing to is the intensification of agriculture and the use of agrochemicals associated with ag intensification. For that reason, I feel really lucky to actually be studying gardens, because I'm here to tell you that gardens are incredibly important for the conservation of species in general, but particularly for insect species. And we've had a couple of the previous talks have talked about the amount of land area that can be found as green space in suburban and urban areas. In the United States, gardeners themselves only manage 2% of total US land area. But when we're talking about urban land area, gardens represent about 1/3 of urban land area, and in some cities can be more than 50% of urban green space. On the right-hand side of the slide right here, I have a outline of the city of Chicago, and each residential garden is in green, each community garden is in red. And so you can see that these gardens are spread across the city. And I want to share with you a study that truly blew my mind when I first read it way back in 2014. What these researchers did, David Lowenstein and his co-authors, is they created what they called a mobile pollinator garden. This mobile pollinator garden was literally a pickup truck with flowering plants in the truck bed, and then crops which are dependent upon insect pollination, such as cucumbers, eggplant, and tomato mixed in with this mobile pollinator garden. They drove around to different neighborhoods in Chicago, parked it for a period of time, counted the number of insect pollinators that visited the mobile pollinator garden, and then took the crop plants back to the lab and measured total yield. Like I said, the crop plants that they use are dependent upon insect pollination to set fruit. You can see right here with an eggplant, you get a nice full firm fruit that is filled out when you have effective insect pollination. When the plants are not pollinated, the mother plant will abscise the fruit from the main stem, resulting in no yield whatsoever. So what really blew me away about this particular study is that Lowenstein and colleagues found that bee abundance and richness was highest in the most densely populated neighborhoods of Chicago. And even more than that, they found that that abundance and richness of bees in the most densely populated neighborhoods translated into better pollination services. And the reason that this blew my mind is because it was the first instance that I'm aware of that human beings were shown to have a positive impact on an ecosystem service. You have more people, you have more gardens, you have more flowers. And where you have more flowers, you have more pollinators. Now, the value of urban garden spaces as conservatories for insects and other urban species really harkens back to an age-old debate in conservation biology that was started way back in the 1970s. This particular debate was known as the SLOS debate. And SLOS stands for single large, the value of a single large preserve versus several small. They represent two very different approaches to land conservation for biodiversity. Ed Wilson, one of the most famous entomologists that ever there was on the side of single large. He argued that if you wanted to conserve insects, it was really important to set aside contiguous expanses of green space for their conservation. And in what I think is truly academia in a nutshell, Ed Wilson's graduate student, Dan Simberloff, actually argued the opposite approach. Simberloff showed mathematically and theoretically that it is possible for several small green spaces, such as fragmented gardens across an urban or suburban landscape, to host as many, if not more, species than a single large expanse. And this is a core part of what my lab group studies. We did it in New York City. Now we do it in Portland, Oregon. But one of the studies that we conducted in the suburbs of New York City in Westchester County, we sampled 21 suburban gardens, which added up together only represented 6 hectares of land area. And we compared the bee communities that we found in these suburban gardens with the bee community in a much larger nature preserve that was nearby. A nature preserve which was 250 times larger, 1,520 hectares overall. We found that the bee communities across both sites were relatively comparable in total number of bee species, the proportion of native bee species, soil nesters, as well as social parasites. A social parasite, which is a bee, is kind of like a cuckoo bird. The mother actually doesn't collect nectar and pollen to provision her little baby bees. Instead, she'll follow another bee species, will enter into the nest, will kill that mother bee, and will lay all of her eggs on top of the provisions that were collected by that other bee. And I know it sounds ghastly, but social parasites are actually considered a positive bioindicator of ecosystem integrity, because you would not have the parasite present in appreciable numbers if its host were not present as well. The only real difference that we found between these two communities were in the amount of floral specialists, and that potentially is not surprising. Most garden spaces include 80% or more of non-native plants, and most floral specialists that are insects are highly dependent upon native plant species, which unfortunately are still not all too common in garden spaces. Now, I also want to make a case for the value of urban garden spaces because in our New York study, we actually discovered 3 new species that had never been collected and described by scientists before. In Pleasantville, Oregon, my former graduate student, Evelyn Fettbridge, collected the holotype specimen, that is the museum type specimen against which all other individuals of that species are compared in a Westchester County garden. 2 novel bee species, including Lasioglossum gotham, the New York sweat bee, were also collected in Central Park as well as Prospect Park in New York City. So I just want to emphasize that in one of the most densely populated cities in the entire globe, there are still new species to be discovered, which I think speaks to the value of urban green spaces. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the plants and the importance of plant selection for insect conservation. Briefly to summarize the main points, floral abundance and how many plants you have in flower at any one time is going to drive insect species richness higher, but native plants make a big difference. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. So as I mentioned in our New York City Community Garden Study, we looked at the species richness of bees as well as butterflies, and we measured everything you could think to measure in these 18 community gardens that we studied: floral area, tree canopy cover, the extent of woody mulch, how close these gardens were to larger green spaces such as the New York Botanical Garden and Central Park, as well as the amount of green space and landscape buffer surrounding each garden. But the number one strongest predictor of bee and butterfly species richness was really how many flowering plants were in bloom. If you want to have more beneficial insect species, you have to plant more flowers. And luckily, that's not too difficult to convince most gardeners to do. And I'll say that even though we published this work in 2010, several other studies that have been published afterwards have found something very similar. Floral abundance drives beneficial insect richness in urban green spaces. So floral abundance is important, but I also want to talk about the value of native plants for insect pollinators. And in order to understand why native plants are so important, we need to distinguish between specialist insects and generalist insects. Generalist insect foragers are things like honeybees and bumblebees that can collect nectar and pollen from a wide array of species. They are not strongly tied into any single plant taxon. However, some bees, such as longhorn bees, have specific associations with plants within a particular family or genus, such as longhorn bees, which favor asters and other composites. We have swallowtail butterfly caterpillars, which can only fully develop on plants within the carrot family, the Apiaceae. And then we have leafcutter bees, which favor plants in the evening primrose family. Now, whereas the longhorn bees and the swallowtail butterfly caterpillars are consuming the plants themselves, and that's why they have a specialist relationship, I want to talk a little bit about the leafcutter bee because it just makes me happy to review why they have such a strong specialist relationship with evening primrose. So what these leafcutter bees do is they actually cut little discs of petal. You can see this mother bee cutting a little disc of petal right here. She's just getting ready to take the last little bite to chomp it off. And then they will fly these little petal discs back to their cavity nest where they will literally wrap their babies. They'll like put a little nectar pollen loaf there, and then they'll lay their egg on top of it. And then they will wrap their babies in these flower petals. And because their young are developing within these cavities wrapped up in flowers, they're very particular about what they recognize as suitable nest site material for their cavity nest. And so in more recent years, my lab has started to look at associations between bees and different flowering plants. This is a particular table looking at the 5 most abundant plants in terms of like most bees abundant on these plants across 3 years of a field study where we screened 30 different plants for insect attractiveness. And what I want you to notice here is that when we included honeybees, which are non-native to our region, that several non-native plants to our region, including catmint, lavender, and oregano, come out as top 5 plants. But when we no longer consider honeybees, we only consider the wild bees in our region, the vast majority of which are native to our locality. We only see native plants to our region coming out in the top 5, which once again, I'm just trying to make an argument that native plants really matter. Flowers themselves are attractive to insects, but native plants are extra attractive to beneficial insects in particular. Now, when we were doing this particular study, one of the gardeners that we worked with came up to us and told us, you know, it's great what you're studying, but those plants are ugly and I'll never include them in my garden. And in particular, folks hated this particular plant, Variliphicelia, which was a top plant for bee abundance across multiple years of our study. And in fact, when we started looking a little bit deeper to understand the plants that people choose versus the plants that pollinators choose, we found near an inverse relationship. So when we look at the top 5 plants for bees, and we look at the top 5 plants for gardeners, only Globegilia could be found on the top 5 list of both. And in fact, the plants which were most favored by bees tended to be least favored by gardeners. So we started trying to have a public relations campaign to raise the profile of these flowers and to help people understand that beauty of a plant really is in the eye of a beholder, and that we're trying to communicate that there's this thing called ecological beauty, that it's not just how pretty a flower is, it's also the life that it brings to your garden that is a type of beauty as well. We started creating infographics to help people understand the number of bee species that they could find on particular plants if they choose to include them in their garden. We included lavender because it's a very common garden plant. And when you talk to a lot of gardeners in my region, every time we tell them that we're studying pollinators, they would say like, oh, you want a great pollinator plant, you should study lavender. So we really included lavender in our studies to be able to communicate You think lavender is great for bees? Well, if you include Douglas aster instead, you'll get almost 10 times as many bee species in your garden. And it was really satisfying to actually see on the ground change, people starting to take chances on plants that they wouldn't have in the past. So I'm going to finish up talking about practices which really limit native plant availability, at least here in the United States, and just a little comment on markets and how we might be able to change these marketplaces. So in the United States, native plant sales make up a minority of annual plant sales, only about 13.4%. And even more notable, many of the plants that are sold in garden stores are actually what are known as cultivars. A cultivar of a native plant is a plant that has been bred from a native plant, but the plant breeder has chosen to change some of the plant traits, such as in this case, we have Douglas's aster, which is purple, and we have Douglas's aster Sauvy Snow, which is white. Usually you can identify cultivars in the marketplace because they have these showy names and single quotes behind the Latin name of the plant. And the fact that the predominant types of native plants sold in garden stores are cultivars is worrying because we and other folks have shown that modifying native plants to change attractive traits to people ends up oftentimes reducing abundance and diversity of insects associated with those plants. So one of the reasons that native plants are such a small part of the nursery plant marketplace, at least here in the United States, is that consumers have a hard time finding them on market shelves, so they don't know about them. If they don't know about them, they're not going to ask for them. If they're not asking for them, they're not going to sell. And if they're not selling, nurseries aren't going to produce them. And then another issue with native plant sales is that many of them are sold in the vegetative stage as very small plugs. They're not showy. They can't compete against the big dahlias and roses that are in full bloom at the garden store. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is to actually share our research out through these plant tags, which show people what the plants would look like once they grow up, and trying to communicate that they're a great plant for bees, which is popular in our region. So to summarize, hopefully you are on board with understanding that insects are important to healthy and functional ecosystems, and that urban gardens can be important conservation spaces for beneficial insects. You don't even have to have a large space. If you plant the right plants, the insects will come. And you can actually rival communities of beneficial insects in much larger intact preserves. Floral abundance is important, but native plants is also important. And unfortunately, there are several issues with the current nursery plant market, which limit native plant availability for consumers. So thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you so much for your another amazing talk. I'm really amazed by how the small urban gardens are important, support biodiversity in urban areas. Yeah, and the role of native plants for sure. So yes, so all the speakers, we have 6 questions are waiting for you. So I'm gonna maybe start with the first question. Maybe I think this is for Professor Sohyun Park. So does staggering flowering help with biodiversity simply because a variety of plants are chosen, or is there also a broader impact of staggering flowers?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the both will be the case, because if we have a more abundant plant species with a lot of flowering plants at a given space, then you can have a high likelihood to have more different flowering seasons. And also, if you can intentionally design the areas, even with a limited selection of the plant palette, if you're very strategic in terms of their timing of the flowering things, you can also have the similar impact as well. I think that question also goes to Gail as well, because she's working a lot on the plant side as well, particularly the pollinator plants. I hope that answers to that question.
Thanks. Yeah, Professor Gail Langellotto, please add if you would like.
I think gardens are special spaces because most gardeners prefer to have flowering plants in bloom all season long. And studies out of California have shown that natural ecosystems bloom in the early spring and then they're done. And that agricultural systems like bloom for a hot second in the late summer and then they're done. So, and especially like in some regions of California where all of the native vegetation gets toasty and dry and there's nothing for insects to eat, you can actually make your garden an insect magnet by having flowers in bloom. In a landscape where not much else is available, it provides season-long forage for a variety of insect species.
Thank you, Gail. So next question, I think it's for Jennifer, I think. But yeah, any speakers feel free to join after Jennifer. So in the Guadalajara, Mexico, there is an association that aims to donate 5 million trees over the next 10 years. So they grow endemic trees in the region on a massive scale and prepare them to be adopted and planted throughout the city. However, they do not always manage to follow up on the adaptation. So what policies or strategies do you consider could improve the monitoring and follow-up of those adapted trees to ensure their survival and promote the success of urban reforestation?
Okay, thanks for the question. There's maybe some of the other speakers would like to contribute to this as well, but I would say from the indicator standpoint, while it's very common for city leaders to make statements about the number of trees being planted, it does lead to kind of mass tree death often because the emphasis is on numbers planted rather than viability of plants once they're in the ground. So we encourage measures such as tree canopy coverage, which encourages trees to grow to their fullest size. That's one alternative, as well as other measures that get into some of the heterogeneity that Sohyun talked about, where you're looking at layers of canopy alongside the roads. And people who are familiar with strategies in Singapore would know about this as well. So there are lots of other ways to incentivize trees to survive and to be healthy. One of my favorites is to find ways to measure soil within cities, but that's definitely not yet standardized. It's kind of an edge method of measuring, but soil health and tree health can be quite connected as well. So I'll pass it on to the other speakers if they'd like to contribute.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Well, I think jumping, I think there's some kind of social component that actually factor into those reforestation efforts. And it also true to a lot of urban greening initiative because there are a lot of tree planting initiative or 1 million trees in the urban centers, etc. But by just planting without any engagement with the local communities, end up having some kind of issues like this. So lack of ownership or lack of monitoring and things like this. So I think it's very important to engage with the local communities in the very first process of those initiatives, and so they can actually understand and acknowledge the importance of it, and also have some kind of attachment to those adapted trees so that they can have long-term relationships with those trees around them.
Thanks, Sohyun. Yeah, I can emphasize more the importance of public engagement and stewardship, in the success of urban greening. So I think Gail is typing, but you can maybe answer the third question, that in Mexico City, the Bacillus thuringiensis, I don't know, is used for a biological control for pests, but it's also affected the insect population in the city. what can we do to support the reproduction of only good insects? I remember my city full of butterflies. Now it's very difficult to find one.
Yeah. So Bacillus thuringiensis will kill any caterpillar that eats it. And so if you have a pest caterpillar, such as the spongy moth here in the United States, for example, it can devastate forest all across the US. It's important to understand when is that pest insect in its caterpillar form and narrow the application window to as small a period as possible, and also narrow the application sites to only the sites where that pest is active. If you were to broadcast BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, across the city, if it were to fall on milkweed, it would kill monarch butterflies. If it were to fall on a butterfly garden, you would kill all of the butterflies that feed there. So you need to understand the natural history of both the pest you want to control as well as the other organisms you want to protect, and narrow the window of application and also the site of application to have as minimal effect on the others and to do the best job you can to control the pest.
Thanks, Gail. I think there is another question to you. In terms of biodiversity in cities, what opportunities do you see for sky-rise greenery, such as sky terraces, green walls, and roof gardens in preserving or even improving biodiversity in dense urban settings?
Yeah, I actually would like to do like the pre-post studies that Sohyun talked about that are lacking. I personally suspect, especially as Sohyun said, if buildings get too high, that greenery on rooftops and facades of tall buildings, that there actually might be an ecological trap that might attract insects, but then the insects don't do well there. So I don't know, they could have a good effect, they could have a negative effect. I think those pre-post studies are important, and collaborations between designers and ecologists are important to figure out how to do it well.
Thanks, Gail. Maybe Professor Sohyun Park, if you'd like to add.
What opportunities do you see for the sky such as great dresses? Yes. Well, I think we are living in a world where a lot of land are occupied by built structures, and there are more urbanization coming along. And so I think those green spaces, whether those are vertical or horizontal surfaces, which is really precious spaces for us to be able to greenify, where we can ensure not only for the human aesthetics, but also to support those non-human beings or more than human beings can actually thrive. So that I see that opportunities are very positive, and we can make every surfaces be more habitable for those species, particularly for those insect species or birds, that we can actually bring them back to the urban areas. And those green walls and terraces and roof gardens will be really, really important given the density of the cities that we are surrounded by.
Thanks. Thanks, Sohyun. Maybe I would like to move to the very last question, maybe to Jennifer and maybe other speakers if you'd like to add. Are there any databases or apps that are specific to geographical location or region which can help gardeners or individuals to choose plants that support biodiversity?
Well, I think that question's more for Sohyun.
Okay, yeah, anyone who can answer.
Yeah, I can start and maybe Gail can jump in too. But yeah, so well, the resources that came to my mind right now is the USDA NRCS website. I mean, the USA NRCS office is always in their regions, and so they're providing a lot of resources like pollinator habitat guidelines or how to grow plants, how to do, the plant native species. And so that might be one resources. And also there are a lot of native garden centers, or I try to think of the examples that's really popular in Texas area in US. Can you help me, Gail? There's a really nice one in Austin, Texas.
Lady Bird Johnson.
Thank you so much. Lady Bird Johnson Bioflower Center that has provided a really amazing website and databases. You can actually put the keyword, whether those are species scientific names or English names or your region or ecoregion, and it can actually got a list of things that are really native to your region and their conditions to grow and all other information. So those are the two that just got top of my head right now. But you can always Google things, and I know there are some kind of a pseudo information or false information out there too, but it is always good to run by the local expert and biologist in your region, just to make sure which ones are really, really native and endemic to your region. Anything to add, Gail?
Xerces Society also has plant lists by US region. Outside of the US, I would say make friends with your local botanist. Botanists tend to be native plant enthusiasts and can be a good source of information as well.
Thanks, Gail. So because of the time limit, I'd like to maybe speakers, if you could answer by typing for the last, the third and second questions, I would really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you, Gail. So what an amazing set of talks. You covered all the scales from site to local, municipal, and the global, and planning perspectives, design perspectives, and scientific evidence. So I think each presentation were really complementary each other and give the full picture of the urban biodiversity. So thank you so much for the speakers for your excellent talk. And I'd like to conclude by promoting the next week webinar. Let me see. Okay. And there was a question about whether the slides would be available. I think if the speakers allowed to do so, we are happy to do so. But at least we have the recording is available to those who register. So yeah, so that will be available at least, and we will follow up with you about the slides. So the next week, the same time, we will have a book talk on the Sustainable Urban Design Handbook. So the two authors from this handbook, Nico Larco, who is a professor of architecture at the University of Oregon, also director of Urbanism Next Center, and also Karin Knudsen, who is also an architect and the mayor-elect of the city of Eugene in Oregon. And also moderator will be the Professor Paola Borin from the University of Auckland, who is the director of the Future Cities Research Hub. So yeah, please join us next week again for this another fabulous speakers and moderator. And with that, I'd like to thank again for those who come to the session, and also those three speakers that we had, and also Jerome who opened the webinar. And yeah, so it's time to be done. So for those who attended for this webinar, yeah, we kindly ask you to leave the room. This link was actually for the Global Sustainability online course for the APRU. So for those students who are taking this course, please change your name, rename yourself with a GSC up front in front of your name, so that we identify you as students. And those who are who came for the webinar, yeah, we will give you like 1 minute to to leave. And then after that, we will start our class. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending and speaking. And yeah, thank you so much. We will keep you posted about the slides and the recording. Yeah, so the global sustainability course will start in like 30 seconds. And we'd really appreciate if you are coming just for the webinar. Yeah, if you could leave in 30 seconds, that would be really helpful. Thank you.